So good afternoon, good morning, good evening, and welcome to the roundtable on Elephant in the Sea, Indo-Pacific with Chinese characteristics, being jointly organized by the Council for Strategic and Defense Research and 9-Line. This is the first webinar in a series of webinars that CSDR and 9-Line are jointly curating on the Indo-Pacific. I think today's webinar is of great significance coming in the wake of the Quad summit in Washington, D.C. and the announcement of the AUKUS. The Indo-Pacific has clearly become a theater of fast-paced geopolitical developments with the revival of the Quad and the emergence of AUKUS, among other developments, of course. Even though these groupings seek to further ties among traditional friends or allies, the focus remains on countering Chinese aggression in the Indo-Pacific, whether or not it is articulated as such, with China increasingly looking to assert its hegemony in the region, using economic partnerships with states serving as its foundation. There is a felt need among various countries to consolidate international efforts to uphold a rule-based order in the Indo-Pacific. So the Indo-Pacific region seems to be moving towards great power symmetric conflict between an ascendant China and a re-energized US, between an asymmetric military bipolarity, as Ashley Tellis would describe it, and an economic multipolarity. Given the Chinese aggression in the region and the growing pushback against it, it would be useful to examine the security architecture in the region and the potential areas of cooperation and competition. So here are some of the questions that this very eminent panel will attempt to address in this roundtable. Does the emergence of AUKUS, which received a lot of international attention recently, supplement the Quad or undermine it? Or is there no significant relationship between the two as the Indian side would like to see it? How exactly is ASEAN positioned amidst the growth of new regional frameworks? How do the recent events affect ASEAN's centrality, the organization's ties with China, as well as with the other great powers? What can be realistically expected from international efforts within and without the Indo-Pacific designed to draw China into a stable and predictable order, thereby preventing its actions from threatening the security interests of other states? We have a stellar panel to discuss these very interesting issues. We have Dr. Rebecca Strating, the Executive Director of the Trobe Asia, and a Senior Lecturer at the Trobe University in Melbourne. She contributes regularly to public debates about politics and foreign policy, writing for policy forums such as Broad Agenda, Lobby Interpreter, Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, and Australian Strategic Policy Initiative, and is a commissioning editor for the Australian Institute of International Affairs publication, Australian Outlook. We then have Dr. C. Raja Mohan, who is the director of the Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore. Professor Mohan was a professor of South Asian Studies at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. Founding director of Carnegie India, New Delhi, he writes a regular column for the Indian Express. And among his recent books are Samudra Manthan, Sino-Indian Rivalry in the Indo-Pacific, published in 2013, and Modi's World, Expanding India's Sphere of Influence, which came out in 2015. Dr. Jabin Jacob is an associate professor at the Department of International Relations and Governance Studies at the Shiv Nadar University, India, and an adjunct research fellow at the National Maritime Foundation, New Delhi. He was formerly fellow and assistant director at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi, and associate editor of the Journal of China Report, journal called China Report. Dr. Maaike is a senior research fellow at the Clingendael Institute. She's also a visiting lecturer at the University of Leiden. She leads Clingendael's projects on geopolitics, great powers, and global governance for the Dutch Ministries of Foreign Affairs and Defense. She's on the editorial board of the Hague Journal of Diplomacy. and the International Journal of Diplomacy and Economy. So let me start with you, Dr. Strating, and your 8 minutes starts now. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Jacob, and thank you to the CSDR and 9-Line for the invitation to participate in this event. It's great to be here. There's lots of important questions that the organisers have set for us, but I'm going to focus my remarks on Australia and the AUKUS deal because, as was mentioned in the introduction, there's been a lot of attention paid to this in and beyond Australia. And so what I want to sort of think about is what it tells us about Australia's Indo-Pacific concept, threat perception vis-a-vis China, and the AUKUS relationship with other minilateral organisations such as the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. And I think in the introduction, Dr. Jacob really hit the nail on the head, if I can use that expression, in that the Indo-Pacific is really about countering China, even if that is not always explicit in the ways that states talk about Indo-Pacific. And I think that rings true for Australia's Indo-Pacific concept, and it also plays a role in the AUKUS arrangement as well, which, it's been less than a month since Australia signed the historic AUKUS trilateral security partnership with the US and the UK. And as I said, it's generated a lot of attention, but the states themselves have been very keen to emphasise that this is an information and technology sharing arrangement aimed at deepening cooperation, joint capability and interoperability between the states. However, the media attention and then the public and the discussions between experts has largely focused on Australia's plans to acquire at least 8 nuclear-powered submarines as part of the deal. And it's no surprise, really, that this has become the central focus of the discussion. But AUKUS itself has received mixed response across the Indo-Pacific region, while some states have cautiously welcomed the news, and I'd be interested to hear what the panelists here think about AUKUS. In Southeast Asia, Indonesia and Malaysian officials have expressed concern about what it might mean for regional stability. And of course, the French President Emmanuel Macron has recently accused the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison of lying about the continuation of the naval contract, which was supposed to build 12 conventionally powered submarines, and that deal has been abandoned as a consequence of AUKUS. But this has, there's quite a bit of there's quite a rift now between Australia and France, which seems to be developing. Within Australia, I think there's been some strong scepticism among at least some experts about the nature of the agreement, even among those who are broadly supportive of Australia acquiring nuclear-powered submarines. The reality is that there's just not a lot of information. There's an information vacuum, which has been filled by speculation and, there's some educated guesswork around what this is going to mean. But for the submarine question, the agreement has established an 18-month period in which Australia, US and UK are going to discuss the optimal pathway to acquiring submarines. So in the meantime, Australia is essentially left without a plan when it comes to a submarine program. What we do between now and 2040 is still up in the air. 2040, we may get nuclear-powered submarines out of AUKUS, but it's a real question mark as to what Australia is going to do between now and then. Extending the existing Collins-class submarines is unlikely to meet Australia's submarine needs for the next 2 decades, and it doesn't look at this stage like leasing submarines is going to be a viable option either. So there's lots of speculation and there's lots of hyperbole about the AUKUS deal, but in my view, what we're left with is little more than an MOU, a memorandum of understanding, an agreement to discuss and to plan for the future for Australian submarines. So I think it is very significant that the US and the UK have agreed to share this sensitive technology with Australia, while other states have not been able to, to generate those commitments from the US and the UK. At this stage, it's essentially a commitment to develop a plan. And Australia, to be fair, it doesn't have a great track record with submarine deals over the past decade, causing a rift with its Quad partner Japan by electing to go with the French tender after former Prime Minister Tony Abbott had seemingly assured the Japanese leaders that they were the preferred partners. And the French program itself was problematic. We knew this. Converting the Barracuda class of nuclear submarines into conventionally powered submarines created a range of challenges. There were cost blowouts, there were problems with timeliness, and this is not new. These issues with the French subs program have been discussed in Australian media, in Parliament, in think tank forums for well over a year. So it's not so much surprising that Australia has elected to abandon the French contract. It's more how it went about doing this that has been the problem. And Australia's diplomacy has been lacking, and I think it has sent an unfortunate signal to some regional partners that Australia's priorities lie with its traditional Anglosphere partners, especially those historical relationships with what are sometimes referred to as the great and powerful friends, the US and the UK. And this is why I think we see the Foreign Minister, Maurice Payne, travelling to Southeast Asian countries to try and reassure partners of Australia's commitment to ASEAN centrality and to regional stability. So this is going to be important for Australia to reassure some of those states that have been less kind of enthusiastic about the AUKUS arrangement. And I think the lack of the sort of the information vacuum is part of the issue. It's allowed a lot of speculation to happen. And the diplomatic clumsiness perhaps explains why we're having conversations about whether AUKUS is going to supplant the Quad, because I don't think that policymakers in Canberra see minilateralism as an either or prospect. I think the Quad is not a forum that was ever likely to provide Australia with nuclear-powered submarine capabilities, so it has a different function. I don't think the Quad is really set up to address all of the region's challenges, and it's much better off focusing on tangible and practical goals and prioritising its objectives, including in maritime security, rather than, I think that the sort of overhyping the expectations of the Quad as being, the region's NATO is probably going to undermine its effectiveness. So I think that the Quad and AUKUS can work together. In some ways, AUKUS might relieve some of the burden on Japan and India when it comes to trying to deter Chinese aggression in the maritime domain in the Indo-Pacific. If anything, AUKUS might present issues, in my view, for the Five Eyes arrangement, given that 2 of the 5 states in this intelligence sharing network, Canada and New Zealand, are not included in this technology and intelligence sharing arrangement. But there has seemed to be some mixed messages about whether AUKUS might be expanded or to other states, or whether this is a one-time deal. So I would like to conclude my opening remarks by saying that Canberra would see the Quad and AUKUS as ultimately working towards the same broader foreign and defence policy goals for Australia. They are complementary. They are not necessarily in opposition. I'm really interested to hear what other panellists have to say, but I think from Canberra's perspective, there's 3 key kind of areas in which AUKUS and the Quad can help Australia operationalise its Indo-Pacific concept. First, by allowing Australia to play a bigger regional role. I think Australia is moving away from its conception of itself as a middle power in a global context to a self-conception of itself as a regional power in the Indo-Pacific. And AUKUS and the Quad is part of that. The second is it really is seen to contribute to deterring Chinese aggression, particularly in the maritime arena. Quad has a maritime focus. Australia's Indo-Pacific concept has a maritime focus, and of course AUKUS has a maritime focus with its top note acquisition being nuclear-powered submarines. And the third point, for all the talk about diversifying relationships and focusing on regional states, which Australia is trying to do as part of its Indo-Pacific concept, it also really remains largely about anchoring the United States in the region. And AUKUS and Quad both do this. They're representative of Australia's shifting attitudes towards China, and it's doubling down on the US alliance. It's committed to US regional leadership, even if there is a recognition that its power is in relative decline. And AUKUS follows an already established trend in Australia of abandoning what used to be described as foreign policy pragmatism, that being not having to choose between the US and China. Since 2017, we are seeing Australia making a choice, and that is moving much more into Washington's orbit. And AUKUS is a reflection of those trends. Rather than it being the start of a trend, it is a continuation of trends that are already in play. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Strating, for those very, very perceptive and very clear comments. I mean, AUKUS and Quad are complementary. One is not intended to undercut the other. At least that's how it's perceived in Australia. Thank you so much. May I now request Dr. Raja Mohan to take the floor.
Thank you, Professor Jacob. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. It's a theme of the times. So let me address one general issue and then look at some of the questions that you have posed to the panel. One, I think it's premature, to call China the dominant power of the Indo-Pacific. Given this vastness of this region, if you look at a more in a disaggregated manner, what we have is China has gained a tremendous influence in the Western Pacific. It is making forays into the Indian Ocean. So there is a long way to go for China in the Indian Ocean. But within the Western Pacific, it has acquired enough capabilities to challenge the American primacy, which has been the dominant feature since the Second World War. My sense is by expanding its power so dramatically and making big moves to expand its influence in the region, it's also triggering a pushback and by compelling the creation of new coalitions against China. Chinese policy, certainly under Xi Jinping, has helped, while it has demonstrated Chinese power and the capabilities. It has also turned some of the neutrals pushed them into the adversary camp, some of its friends into adversaries. Two cases, clearly, India, which was neutral in the historical contest between Asia and the West, today is taking sides with the US. And Australia, which has been a close partner to China on the economic front today, as Dr. Strating said, he's making a choice. So I think many people would not have preferred to make choices, but I think the Chinese policies themselves have triggered a response, and I think we're seeing some of that unfold. Within this, I think the principal question, is it possible to construct a coalition against China? Some of the recent writing from our Chinese friends talks about the Warring States period in the 4th century BC, when the contestation between the 7 kingdoms that was taking place. You had one state trying to build a coalition with all the others to challenge the dominant power, and the dominant power actually making concessions and constructing bilateral relationships with others and eventually dominating the thing. So essentially, the Chinese view is that it's easier to break coalitions rather than construct coalitions, and that many would eventually prefer to do bilateral deals rather than construct a coalition. But I think the Chinese problem, of course, is that they're not making enough concessions to their friends who it wants to be part of, doesn't want them to be part of the American coalition. India is a classic example. The Chinese attitude has been, we don't really care, that we must so much bigger than you, that I don't really have to bother about your favors, that the relative power gap is so large. So therefore, I don't need to be nice to my neighbors. So the Chinese, of course, have a wonderful double-edged sword here, one which tells the neighbors that, look, Uncle Sam is far away, that Uncle Sam is not going to save you. So it makes sense, like a good old Chinese saying, be nice to your good neighbor. A neighbor can help you. Your distant relative can't help you. But at the same time, it is telling the United States, look, we can do a deal. I mean, we can work out a new order here. So we don't need to bother about the smaller states. So therefore, China has played both these cards, but I think its inflexibility, I think, has created the prospects for a successful coalition are quite strong today. And I think that is the principal change that is unfolding. Whether this will succeed or not, of course, it's all open-ended at this point of the time. The story, in some sense, has just begun. Let me address some of the issues that you raised. I mean, Quad and AUKUS, I fully agree with Dr. Strating that they're complementary, not contradictory. Contrary to the Indian debate, which somehow has seen AUKUS as some kind of a threat to the Quad, it's actually quite convenient for India. If the Australians want to take a nuclear knife to the Chinese, I mean, India said, be my guest. I don't see why India should object to that, saying, you're not taking me to the party, or saying, look, that you are ignoring me. So I think it's wonderful from India's point of view. There is a stronger military deterrence that's being generated by AUKUS in that part of the world. Second, I think it also makes it easier for India to push through Quad. Unlike in the Trump administration, the Biden administration has decided to give the Quad a more non-military focus. That, I think, makes India far more comfortable with the new agenda that has been set, focusing on a range of issues from vaccine diplomacy to 5G technology, this new set of issues. So I think India can be far more comfortable pursuing this. That doesn't mean India stops military cooperation with the United States. That India is doing on its own terms, bilaterally, with each of the Quad partners. It does it. So I think it's a good arrangement for India as far as India is concerned. And India will be quite happy to see the AUKUS thrive. India's issue, of course, was France, because India has strong cooperation with France. So my sense is that India will continue to work closely with France, as well as with the Quad, and wish the AUKUS all success in the days ahead. The third, I think, this issue of regional and extra-regional, I think it's a false construct. Is the Chinese keep doing this, Asia for Asians? The Indians used to do it before Indian Ocean only for Indian Ocean. This was never, the issue. This was never, for 500 years, the European powers came into Asia. They dominated the region. So this idea somehow you can push out either, Americans out of Asia is false. Similarly, Indian Ocean, a lot of Indians who talk about extra-regional powers. We couldn't push the Americans out. It's an illusion. We think that we can keep the Chinese out. So the question is not regional and extra-regional. Again, I'll fall back on a Chinese metaphor, which is how do you align the dominant power? Either you build a local coalition as well as mobilize a distant power to produce comprehensive balance. So as the Chinese themselves say, what they did with Soviet Union, align with the far to balance the near, which I suspect is also the strategy of India. I think in this, the regional, extra-regional is a baggage from the past, which makes a little sense. Then we have values and interests, an issue that was raised. Look, I think this is again a familiar dichotomy about order and justice. For all the rhetoric about values, I mean, I can't remember a phase in US foreign policy, at least since the Second World War, where values, overwhelmed interests. So I think let's not overdo this business. It is a question of interest at this point of time. Yes, I mean, aligning with with a friend or partner who's doing utterly terrible things at home will be difficult. But the US has done it before, with China against Soviet Union, with all kinds of characters, Pakistan, you name it. I mean, so I think there is a problem. I mean, the question of values and democracy is important. Large states can't justify their policies purely in terms of balance of power. So the values will play a role, but my sense is that they will be subordinate to the larger question of interests. That brings me to the question of ASEAN centrality. ASEAN centrality is a recent part of recent mythology, but the old name for Southeast Asia was called the Balkans of Asia. Our European friends will know that very well. The Balkans of Asia were contested terrain between different great powers. So when the great powers were in competition, ASEAN, Southeast Asia was torn apart. When the great powers were together in the last 3 decades, ASEAN could emerge as a platform on which regional unity could be built. But today, We're not in that situation. So I think you're going to go back to a situation where ASEAN will come under pressure from the great power rivalry, and I don't see solutions coming out of it. To conclude, the last question, can we accommodate China? My sense is we need to, because China is not going anywhere. China is a large neighbor. It's right in the heart of the Indo-Pacific and Asia. But China is not ready at this point, it looks like, for any accommodation. It wants an accommodation on its terms. It wants to build an order on its terms, which I think large neighbors of China, Japan, India, or Australia, today are not willing to accept. So I think we'll have to wait for a better turn in China. And after all, China also has domestic politics. It's not that Xi Jinping has been crowned emperor for life. That there is a long way to go. But a China that is open to accommodation will find it actually pretty quickly. It can break up the coalition. It can make new friends. And the rest of the world will be eager to make that accommodation. But at this point, the ball is quite clearly in China's court. I'll stop here, President.
Thank you so much, Professor Raja Mohan, for those, as always, extremely perceptive points. May I now request Dr. Jabin Jacob to take the floor.
Thank you, Happy, and thank you to CSDR and 9-Line for this invitation. Let me try and quickly get through these questions in the next 8 minutes. And Happymon, please stop me if I go over time. First and foremost, let me start by saying that if the Quad actively tries to create the impression that it is not a military alliance or that military issues are not paramount or military security issues aren't paramount, then I wonder what the objective of the Quad is. I mean, of course, all the non-traditional security issues that it handles is important, but to go easy or to not clearly signal military interests, I think has to do with a fundamental misreading of what China's own goals and intentions are. And it's also possibly one more reason why we might need to take the values our values into consideration much more seriously. And I'll come to that in just a bit. And as for worrying about what China's response might be or what China might do, let me quote another Chinese saying, which is a saying inside China itself. It says that heaven is high and the emperor is far away. China has enough to do trying to manage its own issues at times. That foreign policy responding to the outside world is only going to be a secondary priority when it comes when it has to balance or weigh it against domestic interests. But having said that, to return to the question of AUKUS, I think the primary message for India and China from AUKUS is that no matter what India does or doesn't do, the US isn't going to put all its eggs in the India basket. At the same time, AUKUS will substantially complicate China's conception of the Quad or of any multilateral grouping. China's approach has so far been, to use the animal analogy that we have as the title of our meeting, to go after the weak, the old, the infirm, the young, the calves of multilateral organizations, and it's targeted the weak members to organize, to sort of weaken the organization as a whole. Now, I agree that, for India, this AUKUS maybe works to its advantage in some senses. I mean, it is a release of pressure, but it's also added pressure because it shows, I think, that New Delhi doesn't seem to have, at least as far as the United States is concerned, it shows that New Delhi is not having a full-fledged plan of action. It's not enough to simply talk when it comes to China. It also needs to show a plan of action. And I think over the last 1 year, one has to wonder what India's plan of action is vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis Chinese troops sitting on Indian territory. And I think the evidence right now says that doesn't seem to be anything of a strategy to evict Chinese intruders. So I think this is, to me, to my mind, the fundamental sort of implication of the AUKUS. Now, about whether the strategic objectives of extra and intra-regional states vis-a-vis China are dichotomous. I agree with Professor Raja Mohan's point that this dichotomy or this distinction between regional and extra-regional powers might be a bit overdrawn. But these interests don't have to be dichotomous, but they will be, as long as the United States thinks it needs to be at the top of the heap always, and India thinks it's an equal partner to the US. The first isn't feasible, and the second isn't true. All right. About how can interest and values be aligned in the Indo-Pacific? First of all, the countries that are contending against China need to agree what their common values are. Yes, interests are important, but without values, it just gives greater openings to the Chinese to do their thing. We see that happening all around. I mean, when we talk about the Belt and Road Initiative, people think about it as a strategic project, an infrastructure project, an economic project. But one of the components of the Belt and Road Initiative is also people-to-people contacts. So the Chinese are working down at the popular level in order to push forward a certain worldview of certain value system, not just at the elite levels, but also at the popular levels. So I think the members of the Quad or anybody else who's aligned to the interests of the Quad will need to eventually, at some point sooner, I imagine, rather than later, figure out what is the value system that is holding everybody together. Interest alone, I don't think will carry the Quad forward, because it's precisely interest that has led to this rift between France and Australia, isn't it? I mean, if they had values, running through much more strongly, they'd be able to get over this hiccup. But as Beck just mentioned, it seems to be this seems to be a rift that seems to be developing. As far as ASEAN is concerned, I agree. ASEAN centrality is a fiction, but it's been a useful fiction for a very long time, and I think it's of course outlived usefulness given what you see the Chinese have been doing with the ASEAN on the code of conduct. How the Chinese have, roped Cambodia and Laos into the Chinese camp, and look at ASEAN's own inability to deal with the Myanmar crisis. But I suppose the problem is no one has an alternative to ASEAN centrality. I mean, neither the US, Japan, or India, I mean, none of them have an alternative to ASEAN centrality, and so they continue with this fiction. Perhaps the way forward really is for the ASEAN itself to now start developing solid trilaterals or even a Quad within the ASEAN. And in that sense, I think the AUKUS could very well offer a template. It could offer a template to countries like India and the United States or even Japan to sort of partner with a couple of smaller countries in ASEAN and do something of the sort, perhaps not at the level of nuclear weapons and so on, but on other issues, on other sort of military cooperation. But mind you, the AUKUS could very well turn into a template for the Chinese to employ within ASEAN. I mean, we already know that the Chinese are helping Pakistan build submarines, so it's not such a big deal for them to extend this model elsewhere. Let me come to the question of what are the, what can we expect from international efforts, or whether international efforts to draw China into some sort of a common understanding of international order can work. Look, I think you have to give up this belief that you can somehow convince China to work with the current global order. Anyone who says that is really not paying attention to Chinese politics, Chinese internal issues. I mean, China is a party state. This needs to be understood. We might think of China as a PRC, but it is a CPC or the CCP that is at the center that should hold our attention. The party, has managed to conflate regime interest and national interest. It puts regime interest over national interest. So, which is why what seems irrational behavior for a state is perfectly rational for a political party, because a political party is seeking to preserve itself in power. It answers to its own members first before it answers to non-members or the rest of the country. And I think that explains World War diplomacy. And that also means that international response, at least for the immediate term, needs to be one of responding in kind to China's actions. The international community, call it the Quad, call it AUKUS, needs to be able to socialize China into understanding that actions will have consequences. And perhaps, over the last year, India has lost an opportunity in this respect. But maybe, we don't always need to consider that opportunities once lost are not, not available again. I mean, India still has those opportunities. So let me stop with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jabin. Thank you so much. May I now give the floor to Dr. Maaike.
Thank you so much for this great opportunity to join this panel. I think it's extremely important for Europe to be engaged with discussions with people in your countries, because so much is happening and there's very little understanding, I think, oftentimes of the sensitivities and of the details. Including your first question, actually, does AUKUS replace the Quad? I was somehow surprised with the question, and I agree with the previous speakers. I do not think it replaces Quad, and it clearly shows that in Europe we've been having, I think, different conversations about the consequences of Quad, so of AUKUS. Including on Quad. So let me share with you a little bit of that from a European perspective. I think AUKUS really has pushed Europeans to ask what it means that these three partners announced their partnership pretty much on the same day that the EU is finally moving on the Indo-Pacific. That had been a while in the making to EU standards. It was actually relatively quickly, just half a year after discussions had started, pushed by 3 member states, including my own, the Netherlands. And then on that very same day that finally the EU is getting to action, that the US and some other countries had been calling and waiting for, I think, we see this announcement which completely overshadowed any discussion, any opportunity to discuss this further with our partners. And I think that is, in that sense, what Beck called diplomatic clumsiness. Definitely also goes for this consequence of AUKUS. So that's really unfortunate. I think, of course, the French were very much looking at this also from in terms of a loss of economic benefits that they were hoping to get from this military contract. And in Europe, we were looking, I think, to support France, not so much perhaps with that, but with the bigger consequence of what does it mean that France was left out, not just left in the dark about this alternative that had been developing. And as you said, Beck, I think you could have seen it coming. The French suggesting that was not the case. Nobody really took that serious. But I think we have been with the French very much aligned on the question of, was there really no way that France could have been, for example, included in this partnership? Why give us, and I'm saying us as Europeans, this big hit in the face at that very day that we were finally engaging with the Indo-Pacific? I think that has been really, that still is the question that is on many people's minds. So was there really no role for France? What does it mean about your perception of what Europe is now finally doing? And if you're saying that, there's so much more that the EU should be doing, I would still agree. But again, this is finally moving ahead. And then the timing of this was very unfortunate, especially because France is also the only member state in the region that has deployed, of course, frigates to the region. It has real estate there, so it needs to also be present. Why exclude it? Obviously the Americans, but also I think Australian people here have been saying that this was never meant as a message of that sort, but it is on people's mind here. And of course, this is also coming against a context of Afghanistan, where the United States also seem to be sending us a message of, okay, Europe, get your own house in order. And then, we might consider having you also in the Indo-Pacific. That is, again, partly understandable, but I think there's important questions that we have to think through and to discuss with ourselves. Two other effects that I would like to mention here in this group, because I don't think it's been very much on the table in your part of the world. Two other AUKUS effects in Europe has been, first of all, that China is now willing to talk to Europeans. We have, of course, have been going through a very terrible year in our relationships with China after that announcement last December of a comprehensive agreement on investment, which is now in the freezer. after the tit-for-tat sanctions. Also after we imposed on China, China imposed much more broad sanctions on many European individuals and organizations. So it has been a terrible year, and the Europeans have been calling for talks. With no Chinese positive response. And then all of a sudden now China comes after AUKUS. So clearly they see an opportunity of a wedge. And I think the realization of that is very clearly present in Europe. But at the same time, this is also considered to be an opportunity, because we do believe that we also need to continue the conversation with the Chinese. If not in person and now in Glasgow, then at least virtually, the Europeans want to talk. So that's one. Another one is the consequences for non-proliferation. So what are the effects of Australia as a non-nuclear weapon state having these nuclear-powered submarines? I think there's very important consequences also of that bigger regime, and the likelihood of the double standard that it will create, or at least sort of exacerbate an existing double standard in the system. And I'm not a nuclear non-proliferation expert, but I'm drawing on those people's expertise here, that other people, that other players may also exploit. That is, I think, also one of the consequences that has been discussed here in Europe, perhaps more than in your part of the world. But I look forward to also hear your views on this. So that gets you to that question of how to align interests and values. And I totally agree with what has been said before, that this is about countering Chinese aggression, and it's about concerns about growing Chinese influence. But there are clear differences, of course, on how to balance that sort of wish to counter with confrontation versus also keeping the conversation in place. And it's interesting, I think, to note that informally, at least here in Europe, there's been less speak of like-minded countries. We used to use that term a lot, like-mindedness. And I think, we hear much less of that. We hear more now of an alignment of interests. Because the values is difficult, like-mindedness on them, democracies and personal freedom, individual freedom with some of the countries, including India, if I may say so. That's sometimes difficult. So it's definitely a shared concern, I think, that we're acting on here, and that is, I think, in Europe now more clearly being pronounced. So in the past few years also, we've heard many politicians in Europe speaking about the rules-based international system and keeping that in place, not just in the maritime and military domain, but very much also in other fields. And today we see an increasingly more a turn to sort of a focus on freedom. A freedom to choose your own government, a freedom of expression, a freedom to be different from the majority in the group. So I think that's also an important trend to note here in the way that this is being phrased, and it clearly shows that values are becoming more important. So now, what does that mean? I was in a meeting with many Dutch defense attachés earlier this week, and I was reflecting on where do we stand in Europe now? What's this? If we look back in a few years, where do we think we stood today? And in all honesty, I'm a little worried that we might still be at that Quad 1.0 moment in time, meaning that's sort of going back to that 2007. When Prime Minister Abe of Japan for the first time proposed the Quad. And as you all will remember, that never really came into being because Australia was not ready to give up or to deal with the likely consequences that China would attach to that more confrontational approach. India was also not quite there yet. And I think this is where we are in Europe, where we see that there is a problem. We feel that something has to be done about it, but we are not quite yet ready to make that choice that I just heard that, some of you, of course, have been more clearly taking. So it's also for that reason, I think, very important for us to know what is happening in the region. I'm personally very happy that finally now there's much greater acknowledgement of what is happening. And I realize the Australians and others are asking for solidarity, and the sending of also a Dutch frigate to the region, I think, showed that we are now showing more willing to show that solidarity. But the question is, how do we make that more sustainable? because with all the problems that we have still of also securing, getting our own house, military security in order here in Europe, we also have to think of different things. And that brings me to what Professor Mohan was also saying about the Quad being more about that military and maritime arrangement. I think this is also very much also important that we look at other fields, because the conflict that we see now is not just playing out in the maritime domain, it's also very much in the digital domain and in cybersecurity. And this is where the EU and the member state like the Netherlands, where we are superpowers, where we do have values to protect and to uphold, and we have shown that we actually can make a difference through regulatory means. And there's dialogues in the making here. So I'm looking forward to hearing much more of that. On ASEAN, the question that was raised, the EU is of course still a strong propagator of ASEAN and ASEAN centrality. And I don't think that most of us, I think that many people here still believe that that it's not fiction. And we're acting sort of on also on a parallel track where we are also engaging more with individual member states. Well, think of the Netherlands, Singapore cybersecurity dialogue for one, but we're not quite ready to again draw the consequence that you have shown. So that's an interesting one. In the EU Indo-Pacific strategy, for example, I think ASEAN is mentioned almost as many times as India, and India really came in first. So that was interesting. To what effect, where are we going? I'll end with that. I have to agree again with Professor Mohan when he said, yes, we have to accommodate China. But I'm afraid that this is also about buying us more time in a way and hoping for a better time when we see a different China. And that won't come, I think, in the next 5 to 10 years. It might come with a change of leadership or with a real troubles with economic growth within China. But that's also likely to have not, in all senses, not going to be good for us. So we have to prepare for long-term engagement here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Maaike, for those for your comments. We have about 45 minutes more for Q&A. So before I open up the Q&A, we have a few questions, but let me sort of try and bring out 2 or 3 points that I thought were very interesting, at least personally for me. There was this point that Professor Raja Mohan raised about values versus interests. That at the end of the day, let's realize that this is about interest and not necessarily about values, which I think Jabin seemed to disagree. And also, I think, if I'm not mistaken, even Maaike seemed to have a slightly different opinion on the issue of values. The whole argument about open and free Indo-Pacific norms, values, democracy, they seem to be the sort of a rallying cry of the Indo-Pacific, at least at this point of time. So if we were to sort of take this out of the equation and sort of then look at the whole Indo-Pacific or the Quad as a construct without this sort of rallying cry, as it were, would Quad or the Indo-Pacific become less powerful? On the other hand, of course, it's good to have this nice sounding rhetoric, but at the end of the day, it is important to ensure that we don't believe in our own rhetoric. We need to know what is the utility of values and what's the utility of interest. I just want to sort of take that argument to the fore of you, and also the majority opinion seems to be that AUKUS is not a replacement for Quad, and AUKUS does not somehow weaken Quad. But Jabin again seems to have a slightly different opinion here. Jabin seems to argue that without a military defense component, Quad is of no great value. You may be looking at a talking shop, talking about just about everything without really much utility. Again, this is a question that I want to bring to the fore of you. And finally, the third point that I want to sort of bring to your consideration for the next few minutes is that Again, Professor Rajamohan made this very interesting point that it is perhaps a bit premature to call China the dominant power in the Indo-Pacific. It may be in the Western Pacific. I'm just looking at if you look at the trade data, China is clearly embedded firmly in the regional trading system. It's probably the biggest trading partner of most of the countries in the region. So it has the trade relationship, the FTAs, the advantage of its location in the center of the region in some ways, and the increasing military capability. Is China really, when we say, the title of today's conference webinar is also Indo-Pacific with Chinese characteristics, framed with the understanding that perhaps China is going to be the dominant power in the region. Where do we stand on that? So may I pose these three questions to all the panelists, and I'll start with you, Maaike, and then we'll sort of go in the reverse order.
Thanks. Yes, on the values versus interests, I think actually values are extremely important in getting us to action. So when the Dutch politicians, I think they need to also explain to the people why we have to invest and why we have to be engaged with this region that is geographically extremely far away from a European perspective, because we're not talking about what China is doing in the Indian Ocean. We've seen the positive face of China, and we've engaged with China in that part of the Pacific, but it's of the Indo-Pacific. But this is really about what's happening in that other side of the Indo-Pacific. So in getting to action, I think we really have to focus on the values, because it's really our freedom that is at stake if you get to the core of things. But I do think it's, as I said, mostly now we're getting to an understanding that in terms of getting to action, it should be the focus on the shared concerns. And in the rhetoric, there might be some talk of like-mindedness, of shared values also, but I think it's really the shared concerns that make a difference here, and that should lead us to cooperate with specific partners. And I see the trend in Europe going in that direction, actually. Whether China is the dominant power already, well, that really depends. If I look at every year at the polls that the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies is doing, in terms of being a thought leader, China is definitely not the dominant power. So that is, I think, also very important. And that is, again, from a European perspective, also a call for action, I think, for us, that is extremely important. Again, in why should we be engaged with this faraway region? Because the region is looking for alternatives. And as I said, maybe not so much in the military domain at sea, but definitely in the cyber and the digital domain, we are capable of offering that alternative. So having that picture clearly in our minds is, I think, important.
Thank you. Over to you, Jabin.
Yeah, okay. So let me just make this clear that I'm in no way saying that interests aren't important. I would even say that interests can obviously at some point take precedence over values. But for democracies, the gap between the priority that you give your interests and that which you give to your values can't be so large. I say this for two reasons. Maaike has already mentioned one. Let me just add to this that this is a particularly fragile time for democracies around the world, the US, the UK, even Australia, India, certainly. So, a call or a reference to values, as Prime Minister Modi just did at the G20 summit, is really about holding ourselves to account internally. And this is a lesson that occurs to me from just studying China. Because if for nothing else, values are important to the Chinese. And if values are important to the Chinese, then what are your values that you're going to throw against when the Chinese come at you with values, right? You can match Chinese military with your own military capabilities, but what are you going to match Chinese values with? And the Chinese are actively now selling and promoting their worldview. So we need to have something that we need to be able to counter this with, right? Now, on the question of the Chinese as the dominant power in the Indo-Pacific, I agree with the general sense that Chinese aren't yet dominant in the Indo-Pacific. If nothing else, it's because the Chinese themselves don't say that they are, or don't think that they are dominant in the Indo-Pacific. They might say there's a great deal of rhetoric in the global times to this effect. But if you look at internal statements, if you look at what they are trying to do you get a sense that they are not sure of this. I mean, look at the disruption of the supply chains. I mean, you think economically they're dominant, but the pandemic disruption of supply chains, I think, has put them on notice. They also don't think that they have the kind of reach in the Indian Ocean yet to justify saying that they are, top dog yet. So I think this is early days yet for the Chinese, and therefore also a great opportunity still for other countries in the region to be able to check, to counter, and to prevent this. And really, we have to prevent this. Let's not be coy about it. We really have to prevent Chinese dominance of the Indian Ocean, precisely, or of the Indo-Pacific, precisely for those domestic factors that I mentioned. So yeah, let me stop with that.
Thank you, Jabin. Professor Mohan first, and then
you can go ahead, others. Yeah. No, I think just 3-4 points that came up. Look, I think the headlines, or a classic you frame in a seminar room, it's easy to put it down as values or interests. But states operate in a messy world that whatever might be the declaratory policies, the life is about finding compromises. So it doesn't work from top down. I mean, how do you work in the Indo-Pacific with a slogan that says values must be respected? But recently, Lloyd Austin, for example, was in Asia. He came to Singapore. He went to Vietnam and to Philippines. He apologized for American anti-Asian racism. I mean, that's talking about values. His focus was on strengthening military cooperation with Singapore. You could argue about Singapore's democracy. He went to Vietnam, tried to strengthen ties there. I mean, if anybody says, look, in this value-based coalition, Vietnam will not be part of dealing with China, I mean, I think that would be unrealistic. And when he went to Philippines, his focus was on getting the status of forces agreement renewed. So this idea that the Western leaders can come and wave their finger and say, look, we are only about values. I think we passed that peak. That phase is over. So I think today there will be a balance. I mean, it is not that the US or the Europe always talk about values. It's not being given up, but it has to be managed in the context of specific interests that are at stake. So I would say focus on the practice. Don't go by what they say, go by what they do. And historically, the tilt is always towards interest. Second, there are complications. Is climate change a value or an interest? John Kerry wants to do a deal with the Americans and opposes the rest of the administration. Says, look, climate change is more important than balancing China. So you could argue climate change is an interest, global interest, collective interest, a higher, superior principle. Or you could say, look, that can't be subordinate to fighting the Chinese political system. So you can take your pick. I mean, it cuts both ways. So it's not as simple. Take Europe, for example. Is Europe, does German auto industry think values are more important than access to the Chinese market? When the Europeans say, look, China is both a partner on global issues, is a systemic competitor and an economic rival, I think that's a nice way that everything exists vis-a-vis China. This idea that it can only be one thing or the other, I think is a problem. In real world, it never operates in those terms. Second, I think Jabin had a good point. I mean, whether Quad have any credibility if it is not a military alliance. Look, I think you've got to look at, shall we say, I mean, for lack of a better term, the Oriental cunning, if you will. When India says Quad does only certain things, India is not saying it is not going to do military cooperation with the US. In fact, all indicators show India's bilateral military cooperation with the US has dramatically increased in the last 3 years. And that is a direct response to the Chinese military actions. You can say it's good enough. That's a different question. Just because you say Quad is not a military forum doesn't mean India doesn't do military cooperation with the Quad members. With all of them, it has 2+2 dialogues, it has logistics arrangements, it is doing a lot more. So when the Indian Foreign Secretary says, look, a Quad is not same as Malabar, he's being, shall we say, diplomatic. But the fact is on the ground, again, go by what India does, that everything doesn't have to be done under the Quad framework. As long as India expands its military cooperation, then I think the function of balancing China through military means is growing. On China's centrality, my sense is, look, there is no way of escaping China's size. It is real. But I think if you look at trade, yes, it's a #1 trading partner. But will this remain forever if some measure of decoupling takes place? The evidence is not there. If you look at investments, the cumulative investments in Asia of the Japanese and the Americans is far higher. So it's not as if they're being replaced. If you say, look, certain sectors, China is going to be kept out, for example, on 5G, if that works. So I think you're beginning to see a story and not just go by the current trade figures are not going to tell you the whole story. And finally, I just wanted to refer to non-proliferation, which Maaike referred to. Look, I think what's happened with the AUKUS, it's not about double standards of non-proliferation. I mean, after all, the NPT itself had a provision, which I believe was introduced by our European friends, leaving the option open for creating an option to take out material into a military nuclear propulsion. After all, the NPT prohibits nuclear weapons. It does not prohibit military uses of nuclear propulsion. So these two are different things. So it's completely kosher, if you will, legal under the NPT. The verification issue, I mean, Americans are saying, look, the stock of enriched uranium is going to come out of their stock. So you're not taking something out of the safeguarded stock. You're taking something out of the Americans' weapons stock. Americans have no plans to open it up in between. It's a lifetime enriched uranium fuel. So therefore, I don't see a proliferation being a problem. But we got to recognize the old firewall between nuclear and non-nuclear is going to break down. Recently, I don't know how many of you have followed, South Korea has tested an SLBM, which they say will be used with non-nuclear warheads. Maybe occasionally drop some flowers on President Kim. Now, why is South Korea developing ballistic missiles that it as a non-nuclear state? North Korea is doing the same. Most countries are going to see, look, given the flux in the regional environment, this idea there would be a clear barrier between nuclear and conventional weapons, I think that's going to be a problem. The system is going to respond to new challenges. And the NPT is not Moses code that can solve all the problems. The question is, how do major powers accommodate the changes that are taking place? And the US, I think, in constructing Indo-Pacific and drawing India into it, in looking beyond the traditional alliances, in doing AUKUS that breaks a norm on supplying reactors, is responding to a problem. So this is going to be driven not by the first principles of the NPT, but by the objective circumstances on the ground, the nature of the technological change, and the adjustments different countries are making. And I think dealing with that, I think all of us will have to be prepared for a lot of gray zones in the years ahead.
Thank you, Professor Rajamohan. Dr. Strating.
Yeah, thank you. The question of values and interests, I mean, I can't see these as being easily separated. I think that what our actions reflect our values, even if they're not our stated values or the ones that we put in our declaratory policy. And so our interests are ultimately informed by the principles and the values that we hold. There are, of course, examples where there might be a conflict between what our stated values are and interests. But as I said, I think it's important. And Professor Mohan made the point, it's important to determine what it is that states do, not just what they say. But that doesn't mean I don't think narratives and rhetoric matter. I think they do. I think they play an important role in international relations. And one of the risks of talking up democracy is that it exposes hypocrisy. That's the same issue around the use of the term rules-based order, because, some of the so-called like-minded states, which is a term that I've criticised myself in my writing, but some of the like-minded states don't necessarily agree on the rules, how they're interpreted. We can talk about freedom of navigation as a norm or a principle underpinning how we engage with the world's oceans, but even the Quad states don't necessarily agree on how to draw some of the maritime boundaries, or what kind of military activities are acceptable to undertake in an EEZ, or rules around innocent passage. So the values, it's one thing to talk about a rules-based order, it's another to sort of dig in and try and understand what each state means by that and the sorts of values that they bring to their interpretation of those rules. And of course, when they decide to to elude those rules, which not just great powers seek to do sometimes, but middle powers do as well. I think there's a real risk as well in states sort of talking about democracy in a region that is mostly non-democratic. If we're going to be heading to this Cold War 2.0, democracies versus authoritarianism, well, there's going to be a lot of states that are not quite clear where they're going to sit on in terms of that bifurcation. And that's why I think Australia, a country like Australia, has tended to use a more neutral phrase like rules-based order, because it's a way of trying not to alienate states in the region that aren't liberal democratic states. But I think in the last year or so, there's been a real shift in some of the narratives, particularly the Biden administration, towards talking much more about democracy. And I'm not sure that is the best approach in the Indo-Pacific region, where there are very mixed political systems, and some of the states that we consider to be like-minded, Vietnam in the South China Sea, for example, aren't necessarily democratic states. So there are risks there. On the Quad, I mean, I think part of my comments were that the Quad really needs to prioritise, and in order to sort of not become a talk shop, that's going to be something that it needs to do. But I saw a comment about Malabar, and from an Australian perspective, Malabar was the point where I think Australians went, oh, the Quad is real now, like we're finally being invited to Malabar. But I think it needs to be a lot more than, joint naval exercises. But that really requires recognising that the Quad is not going to be able to do everything, and it's not designed to do everything, and that it needs to have really specific and tangible goals if it is to move beyond being a talk shop. The third point about Chinese dominance, I mean, I don't have too much to say about this other than we know, I think there's been an attempt to shore up a status quo order that no longer exists. I think we're in flux, and I think that there are multiple orders rather than there being one kind of order, and that's really the problem in trying to determine whether or not China is dominant, is that it's a real mixed picture depending on what order we are looking at and what region we are looking at, because in East Asia, there's and in the maritime East Asia, China is becoming more dominant, but as the other panelists have said, the picture is very different in the Indian Ocean. But also, we haven't talked about the South Pacific either, where, you've got real concerns about China becoming more influential, but in actual fact, Australia and the United States and New Zealand and those sorts of countries, and France, which is an Indo-Pacific power, having territorial and maritime interests across the Indian Pacific and the Southern Oceans, these countries remain influential despite those concerns. So it's important, I think, not to exaggerate some of the issues around things like debt diplomacy, for example, across these regions. The fourth point I'd like to make, because there was a discussion around nuclear proliferation, really important point, Maaike, that you make about that. I'm, as an Australian, astonished that that decision was made without any public discussion or any kind of heads up that Australia is going to, potentially, because some of it is still hypothetical, but that is the plan, is to acquire these capabilities. I think that there might be issues with this in terms of public opinion when it comes to issues around, say, waste disposal and issues around Australia's sovereign capabilities, if we have to rely on another state in order to be able to fuel these capabilities. So I'm still a little bit astonished that this happened and there wasn't a real discussion or a debate about it, because it's significant that Australia has made this decision when it didn't, only a few years ago, when it elected to try and convert nuclear submarines into conventionally powered submarines. And it has ramifications for our relationships with the Pacific and with New Zealand, containing states that are very concerned about nuclear power.
Okay, I think the consensus seems to be that we are not yet looking at an Indo-Pacific with Chinese characteristics. China is not yet the predominant power in the Indo-Pacific, as Professor Raja Mohan correctly pointed out. But I think what is clear from this discussion is that the challenge that China poses is unmistakably clear. And call it whatever you want, but I think the more attention that is paid to it, the more responses that there are to that challenge, the better it is. You may call it AUKUS, you may call it Quad, you may call it Quad Plus, Malabar. As Professor Raja Mohan put it, a rose is a rose at the end of the day. So, but I think that attention is of great importance, as all the panelists have pointed out. I think the discussion on values versus interests is a very interesting one. Again, as Rajas have pointed out, it is a messy world, and decision makers have to make difficult decisions. Even though he would acknowledge that these values and principles are of great importance. I think what may be of interest to researchers and academics is perhaps sort of try and understand what these values are, what these principles really are. When we talk about the Indo-Pacific, when we talk about the values of the Indo-Pacific, what exactly are these values? It is good to. It is, I think, perhaps important to go beyond the feel-good rhetoric about values and principles and norms, as it were. This empty rhetoric will not really help. So, to that extent, I think an attempt at defining some of these values and principles and norms might be of great interest as a normative project in itself. In trying to sort of further understand the geopolitical construct called the Indo-Pacific, as it were. Clearly, again, what we are witnessing today is an unprecedented amount of strategic focus on Indo-Pacific and China. Compared to a few years ago, as many of you pointed out, even India, for that matter, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, the focus on China was of an entirely different kind altogether. Today, it is characteristically different, and to that extent, again, going back to what Professor Raja Mohan said earlier on in his presentation, China may have made a mistake by projecting power or expanding power so rapidly, and that has sort of brought about a sort of coalition of countries to sort of respond to it. May I take this opportunity to thank all the four panelists, Professor Raja Mohan, Dr. Strating, Dr. Jacob, Dr. Maaike, for joining this webinar on behalf of CSDR and the 9-Line.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.